Policy Panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution in collaboration with the Geneva Environment Network. This event is part of a series of events that have been organized in the run-up to the 3 negotiation sessions to establish this panel since the adoption at the United Nations Environment Assembly back in 2022 of a series of landmark historical resolutions, including the one that decided to convene the ad hoc open-ended working group. In the context of the 3 planetary environmental crises of climate change, nature, biodiversity, and land loss, as well as pollution and waste, 2 intergovernmental bodies to help policymakers taking the adequate actions have been set up for 2 of these crises. The United Nations Environment Assembly resolution that was adopted 2.5 years ago aims at setting up a science policy panel for the 3rd crisis on pollution and waste. The working group that was established following the adoption of the resolution was expected to conclude its substantive discussions on proposals for the establishment of the panel last June, and we refer to that session as 3.1. The proposals are now expected to be finalized next year at the resume session that we refer to as 3.2. Our event today aims at providing an opportunity for governments and other stakeholders to be informed of this process as it stands at the closing of the session, the Open Working Group session 3.1. Before I hand over to the moderator, let me remind all our attendees that the documents, the video, and the summary of this event will be made available as usual on our website. You can find the link on the screen and in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box, and there are slides also on the screen to explaining how to access that box. We have a dedicated session to answer these after the presentations. It's my pleasure now to turn on to Ms. Nalini Sharma from the Open Working Group Secretariat, who will moderate and guide you throughout this event. With that, Ms. Sharma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you very much to the GEN as well to organize another very interesting webinar ahead of us. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce to you Her Excellency Saklen Saida, our Open-End Working Group Bureau member and ambassador to Pakistan to Germany. Ms. Saida, you can have the floor, please, to make your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Secretariat, OEWG, SVP, also the Secretariat for that, UNEP Secretariat for supporting us in this whole process and for allowing me this opportunity to be a part of this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, like I said, it's a great honor and pleasure as a member of the Bureau for the ad hoc open-ended working group to the Science Policy Panel to welcome you today in this session on the foundational document and rules of procedure at the close of OEWG 3.1. The ad hoc working group on Science Policy Panel to further contribute to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution is approaching a critical juncture with the upcoming negotiations at its resumed 3rd session that we will be having, the OEWG 3.3, being planned for 2025. As you are very well aware that negotiations started in 2022 and have progressed in June 2024 when the working group convened for the 3rd time. Yet there are several main areas of discussions for finalizing the foundational document and the draft rules of procedure. 2 key documents that will be negotiated at the resumed session. The foundational document sets out the objective and functions, operating principles and approaches and institutional arrangements for Science Policy Panel, while the rules of procedure establishes the framework for decision-making and operational aspects of the panel. It is my hope that this webinar will help us all, governments and stakeholders, provide us an opportunity to be informed of where the process stands after OEWG 3.1. Information in this webinar will be presented on progress made in OEWG negotiations to date, main discussion areas at the close of OEWG 3.3 and the roadmap to OEWG 3.2. And the next UNEP's principal legal officer will present a draft rules of procedure as they stand at the close of OEWG 3.1. As we navigate through this session, we encourage your active participation and engagement through the question and answer function, and we have allowed time for addressing some questions at the end of this webinar. Before we proceed, I do want to provide some additional context on the process that has led us up to here. The mandate for the ad hoc working group is set out in Resolution 5/8, which was adopted in March 2022, as you're very well aware. The resolution states, quote, decides that a science policy panel should be established to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, which is as such, I've quoted from para 1 of the resolution. And then I again quote that, and that the panel should be independent intergovernmental body with a program of work approved by the member governments to deliver policy relevant scientific evidence without being policy prescriptive, which is the para 3. The resolution also provides for the ad hoc open-ended working group to prepare proposals for science policy panel considering a variety of issues. And the resolution further requests the UNEP Executive Director, upon completion of the proposals prepared by the ad hoc open-ended working group, to convene an intergovernmental meeting for the purpose of considering the establishment of the science policy panel. Based on existing negotiations, the envisioned objective of the panel is to strengthen the science policy interface to contribute to the science management of chemicals and waste to prevent pollution for the protection of human health and environment with following 5 core functions. Number 1, undertaking horizon scanning. Number 2, conducting assessments. Number 3, providing up-to-date information, identifying gaps, supporting communications, and raising public awareness. Number 4, facilitating information sharing. And number 5, capacity building. The first 4 were already identified by UNIA in the resolution launching the negotiations. And as you know that my fellow bureau member, Linda Koski, will speak on the progress that has been made on this and other items in her presentation. Without further delay, we should actually start with the webinar so that we can actually move on to a successful move towards completion of OEWG 3.3. Thank you so much. I would now like to hand it over to Nalini Sharma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Saida, for this warm welcome to this webinar. So to get started, it's my pleasure to invite and introduce Linda Koske, who is the Open-Ended Working Group Bureau member and rapporteur. And she also is the head of the MEA's Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Forestry of Kenya. Linda, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Nalini. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, as a member of the OEWG Bureau and as the rapporteur, it is my pleasure to provide an update today on the progress made to date in negotiations on a new science policy panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention. I hope, colleagues, you're able to see the screen and the slides. I'll be speaking on the slides that are on the screen. In accordance with UNEA Resolution 5/8, OEWG started its work in October 2022 in Nairobi. We can see that as the first bullet on the screen. Next, we convened in Bangkok in February 2023 for a resumed first session where we exchanged views in deep dive dialogues and set to work on proposals for the panel's operation. We then met in Nairobi in December 2023 for our second session, where we agreed to work on the basis of a skeleton outline and draft text of proposals for the panel. Progress was made in focused contact groups, and this work was also used to identify intersessional work that the Secretariat would undertake in advance of the third session in Geneva in June 2024. Mid this year, the OEWG reconvened in Geneva for its first third session. The meeting took place over 5 intense days from 17th to 21st June. Whereas important progress was made, the OEWG was not able to conclude its work during this week. It was therefore agreed to resume the work at a later date, back to back with the intergovernmental meeting. A detailed account from the meeting can be found in the report of what is now referred to as the first part of the third session of the ad hoc open-ended working group on a science policy panel to further contribute to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, or in short, OEWG 3.1. The report is now available in all 6 UN languages on the OEWG 3 website. I would like to draw your attention in particular to the outcomes of the negotiations, which are annexed to the meeting report. This is where you will find all the text as it stood at the close of our June 2024 negotiations that took place in Geneva. Each annex includes a draft decision and an associated annex or annexes. The first contains the draft decisions. That is what you can see on the screen. The first contains the draft decision on the establishment of the panel as described in the foundational document. The compilation of proposals for the establishment of the panel. This sets out the panel's objectives and functions, operating principles and approaches, institutional arrangements for the panel, and the evaluation mechanisms. The second draft decision contains the draft of the decision, including recommendations to the first session of the governing body of the panel, including the draft rules of procedure. Next, let me provide a brief overview of key areas of progress at OEWG 3.1. Before I do so, I will of course remind you of the agreement that we are following, the norm, that like in other processes, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Nevertheless, I can point to areas of convergence, and I will start with the foundational document. Significant progress was made regarding the capacity building function. Africa, EU, and GRULAC put forward a new joint text proposal that was accepted as a basis for negotiations. The only remaining brackets relate to whether the panel should ensure gender balanced, gender inclusive, or gender responsive participation. On operating principles of the panel, good progress was made in contact groups and informal groups and streamlining the text, with the agreement that the section would be titled Operating Principles and Approaches of the Panel. Noting the instrument will be a non-legally binding instrument, participants agreed that the panel will rather than shall be guided by a set of operating principles and approaches in carrying out its work. For the institutional arrangements, section of the foundational document that sets out the architecture of the panel, there was a general agreement on the structure of a panel with a governing body or a plenary in bracket, a bureau, subsidiary bodies, notably an interdisciplinary expert committee, and a secretariat. All sections of the institutional arrangements were discussed with significant progress in contact groups and informal groups. Discussions on what was needed for the establishment of the panel vis-a-vis what can be decided by the panel itself at a later date helped move forward the process. For example, detailed text on strategic partnerships may not need to be defined in the foundational document. In discussions of the draft rules of procedure, several sections were identified as having significant overlap with the foundational document. This will be further expanded on by other speakers in today's webinar. The process for determining the work program, where the contact group reached some consensus in taking a tiered approach for information requirements, and the procedures for the preparation and clearance of panel deliverables, were also tabled at OEWG 3.1 for further consideration by the panel's governing body. The contact group clarified the definition of several deliverables, including assessments and synthesis reports. While much work remains on this document, it was helpful for building understanding of the panel's work and helping progress on other issues. Regarding the conflict of interest policy, the contact group continued negotiations which had already begun at the second session of OEWG. Discussion focused on implementation procedures for identifying and managing conflict of interest. The draft proposal for financial procedures was not considered during OEWG 3.1. This document will be forwarded to the second part of the third session as an information document. Finally, in Geneva in June, we also had a proposal for a name for the panel from the Africa group, which sparked further suggestions from others. In addition to the 129 governments that participated in the meeting, OEWG 3.1 was also attended by stakeholders from a broad array of non-governmental, industry, academic, and other groups, as well as by representatives from intergovernmental organizations, multilateral environmental agreements, and other science policy interfaces. Delegates' engagement in the third session reflects our ongoing commitment to think across sectors and connect with those involved in and affected by the sound management of chemicals and waste and the prevention of pollution. Next, the Secretariat will tell us more about the main discussion areas within the foundational document at the close of OEWG 3.1. I thank you all, and I now wish to hand it over back to Nalini Sharma to continue taking us through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, to give us this update on the progress that's been made so far in the open-ended working group process. Next, let me give the floor to Ms. Tessa Goves, who is the Principal Coordinator of the Open-Ended Working Group Secretariat. Tessa, you have the floor. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nalini. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. Before providing further information on the main issues that are remaining at the close of OEWG 3.1 regarding the foundational document, let me also first congratulate the Geneva Environment Network with its anniversary and thank Diana and her team for the excellent collaboration and providing this continued opportunities to have this type of session as we have today as part of the Road to OEWG 3.2 webinar series that allows governments and stakeholders to stay informed and to share their views. As you have just heard, negotiations at the resumed third session will focus on finalizing the foundational document and the draft rules of procedure. The Bureau met in September and reflected on the outcome of OEWG 3.1, including the main discussion areas that remained at the close of OEWG 3.1. And today I will briefly speak to these as far as they relate to the foundational document. And to remind ourselves, this slide shows the main elements of the foundational document, A to D, whereby the institutional arrangements are subdivided in 6 sub-items. So A is the scope, objective, and functions of the panel. B, the operating principles and approaches of the panel. C, the institutional arrangements for the panel, further subdivided in the plenary or governing body of the panel, the Bureau, committees and subsidiary bodies, Secretariat, financial arrangement, strategic partnerships, and the last element is evaluation of the operational effectiveness and impact of the panel. Next slide. Let me start with some general observations regarding the main discussion areas at the close of OEWG 3.1. First, the length of the documentation that was tabled for OEWG 3.1 posed some challenges to conclude discussions within limited time available. Thanks to the hard work of delegates, the current status is a more focused and a more streamlined document of 7 pages. Second, there was a recognition from early on of the important linkages between documents, and notably between the foundational document and the draft rules of procedure. Some discussion areas that I will present will therefore relate to both the foundational document and the rules of procedure. And third, discussions remains to be concluded on several items throughout the foundational document that will require ensuring the use of consistent terminology. The most prevalent example was actually already shown in the outline, namely the use of the term governing body of the panel or plenary. You also find this in paragraph 4. Another example relates to the reference to gender, including in the new text describing the capacity building function and in the operating principles and approaches. Other main discussions include membership, decision-making, roles of stakeholders, financial arrangements, and the secretariat. The next slide. When it comes to membership of the governing body of the panel or the plenary, the current status is reflected on the screen. You will see from the brackets that the text as it stands in paragraph 5 points out to differences in positions. The OEWG will need to decide who are the members of the governing body of the panel. And in addition to resolve who can be a member, there's a related aspect on how to become a member. Turning to the next slide, decision-making is addressed in both the foundational document and in the rules of procedure. The discussion area revolves around consensus and applying this to procedure matters and matters of substance. This slide shows the status of the text in the foundational document at the close of OEWG 3.1 under the operating principles. And if anyone is particularly interested in operating principles, let me remind you that we organized an earlier webinar with Jen on this topic, where we heard from other science policy interfaces on how operating principles are guiding their work. The next slide. The main discussion here is on roles of stakeholders. Part of the discussion relates to who can participate in meetings and in what capacity. For example, in meetings of the governing body, as expressed in paragraph 6, or the example shared on the screen, which shows the status of the text regarding participation in the interdisciplinary expert committee, a subsidiary body of the panel. In another part of the foundational document, such as in paragraph 8c on functions of the governing body, the discussion on the roles of stakeholder was linked to who can make submissions and requests for the work program. But please note that other aspects, including those related to the conduct of the meeting, including regarding notices of meetings or availability of interpretation at meetings or bodies other than the governing body, and whether meetings are open or closed, are also raised in the rules of procedure. The text on the financial arrangements on the next slide in the foundational documents also retains brackets as shown here for paragraph 24. Main discussions relate to who can contribute to the trust fund and if additionally funding can be earmarked for specific activities or not. Finally, the main discussion on the secretariat in the foundational document under institutional arrangement concerns the provision of secretariat services, see notably paragraph 22, for which the status of the text at the close of OEWG 3.1 is currently shared. In this regard, I'm pleased to also inform you from UNEP's side that we have continued our informal engagement with the colleagues from the World Health Organization on this matter. I would like to conclude by providing a brief overview of the OEWG process, including the roadmap to OEWG 3.2, and speak to some of the preparations that are underway. First, you will note that the resumed third session will be held back-to-back with the intergovernmental meeting as requested by the OEWG, the blue and the yellow bullets at the end of the timeline. To reiterate, the key document for consideration during the resumed negotiations at OEWG 3.2 will be the foundational document, the draft rules of procedure, and the related draft decisions. The text as it stands at the close of OEWG 3.1 will be the starting point for the negotiations at the resumed session. And just to again mention that the text on proposals for the establishment of the Science Policy Panel can be found in Annex 1 of the draft report of OEWG 3.1. And that it is available in all UN languages. The expected outcome of OEWG 3.2 is that the proposals for the Science Policy Panel are finalized, that decisions for the intergovernmental meeting are finalized, and that the draft rules of procedure are finalized, for which I will shortly hand back to Nalini to give the floor to our colleagues from the Law Division, with whom we collaborate very closely. This would then allow the intergovernmental meeting to consider the decision on the establishment of the panel as described in the foundational document and the adoption resulting in, hopefully, the establishment of the Science Policy Panel. In the meantime, the Secretariat will continue to work closely with the Chair and the Bureau on the preparations for the resumed session of OEWG 3. We will continue with the webinar series that you were seeing on top of the timeline for the road towards OEWG 3.2. We also expect continued regional consultations and informal consultations in preparation of OEWG 3.2. And some of these can be self-organized and possibly facilitated by our able Bureau members. And the Secretariat will prepare and post the necessary documentation and may solicit written submissions on the documentation tabled for OEWG 3.2, as we have done in the past prior to previous sessions. Finally, I will also mention that we will organize a pre-session technical briefing before the start of OEWG 3.2, which will be organized with Jen through a webinar. And you will have noted that the date and the venue of the resumed third session and the subsequent intergovernmental meeting, which OEWG requested to be held back-to-back, is yet to be confirmed. I'm pleased to announce that we have received expressions of interest to host the resumed session, and the Bureau will review the proposals with the support of the Secretariat. The Secretariat will be sure to reach out to the SPP OEWG focal points and through other regular channels to communicate the date and the venue as soon as these have been confirmed. So please stay tuned, and with that, I'll hand back the floor to Nalini. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa, for this overview of main discussion areas at the close of Open-Ended Working Group 3.1 and the roadmap towards Open-Ended Working Group 3.2. So next, we will hear from our colleagues in the Law Division, Principal Legal Officer Stadler Tengrove and Legal Officer Alvin Gashi, who will focus on the draft rules of procedure. I believe Stadler will speak first. So Stadler, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tess. Actually, Alvin was going to open and then I would continue. So Alvin, you have the floor and then I will continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stadler, and hello everyone. I'll walk you through the draft rules of procedure. And during the second session of the ad hoc open-ended working group, the Secretariat was tasked with drafting rules of procedure. These rules are crucial as they shape how the panel will operate. And as requested, the Secretariat drafted these rules drawing inspiration from established bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, and the United Nations Environment Assembly. The draft rules of procedure have been shaped by the outcomes of the second session and the first part of the third session, particularly Section C of Document 2 on institutional arrangements for the panel. So we have sections 1 to 7 on the next slide, well, on the current slide. And these rules of procedure outline how sessions of the governing body of the panel will be conducted. And the rules as drafted follow the agreed outline at the second session of the ad hoc open-ended working group. They cover important aspects such as the scope or purpose of the rules, the definitions, session logistics, and membership details. The rules outline the different modalities of participation in sessions of the governing body of the panel, including for members and observers, and also states not members, United Nations bodies, and other intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. There's also rules on admission and participation of observers. There are rules on agenda setting and notification, and rules on representation, credentials, and accreditation. On the next slide, where we have sections 8 to 17, this expands on the panel's organizational framework, and the rules address the membership and operation of the Bureau, covering aspects like the nomination and election of Bureau members. And additionally, they delve into the functioning of subsidiary bodies, where they specify the membership, operation, and the election processes for bodies like the Interdisciplinary Expert Committee, alongside general rules applicable to other subsidiary bodies. I'd like to remind everyone that these rules establish protocols for conducting business during the sessions of both the panel's governing body and its subsidiary bodies. So we have rules regarding decision-making, where it is outlined the processes for substantive and procedural matters, and it incorporates rules on voting and elections. And furthermore, the rules also include provisions for language usage, and they outline the procedures for modifying the rules of procedure. You'll find that annexed to these rules is a draft policy and procedure for admitting observers. And I'd like to outline this is directly tied to Rule 7 within the rules of procedure. I will stop at that point, having provided the overview of the rules of procedure, and also to stress again that the Secretariat prepared these rules based on the IPBES, IPCC, and the UNEA rules of procedure. And at this point, I'll hand back to you, Stella. Thank you.
Stadler, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Alvin. So in terms of membership of the panel is dealt with in Rule 5 of the Rules of Procedure, which is one of the rules that is actually not yet agreed to, as far as I understand it. It refers to membership of the governing body is open to states members of the UN and members of specialized agencies who may become members of the governing body of the panel by expressing their intent to do so. So that basically follows standard UN practice. And then it also addresses as member states and also members of specialized agencies. Next slide, please. Rule 7, paragraph 2 states that any state member of the United Nations or member of a specialized agency that is not a member of the governing body of the panel and any United Nations entity or secretariat of a multilateral environmental agreement will be considered as admitted by the governing body of the panel as an observer and need not submit an application or other document. Again, that refers to any member state or member of a specialized agency that has not expressed its intention to become a full member of the panel, and any United Nations entity, which could include UNDP or other United Nations funds and programs, or secretariat of a multilateral environmental agreement, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, will be considered as admitted by the governing body as an observer and need not submit an application or other documentation. Rule 7, paragraph 3 provides that bodies, organizations, and agencies that already have observer status with any United Nations system entity or are accredited to UNEA or to any MEA are considered observers of the panel if they so request, except as the governing body of the panel decides otherwise. Next slide, please. Now, a common practice within the United Nations is for full members, to accredit themselves and to submit credentials. Rule 12, paragraph 1 provides that each member participating in a session will be represented by a delegation consisting of a head of delegation and such other accredited representatives, alternate representatives, and as advisors as it may require. The credentials of the representatives, now credentials is of course a formal document that lists the head of delegation and accredited representatives, have to be signed by or on behalf of a appropriate government authority. In other words, it has to be an official communication of the member and will be regarded as appropriate credentials for the participation of the individuals named therein in all activities of the session. Next slide, please. Now, the responsibility for reviewing credentials is an intergovernmental responsibility, and it is therefore for the Bureau to examine the credentials and submit a report thereon to the governing body of the panel. So what will happen is that the Secretariat usually collects the credentials, submits a report to the Bureau, and the Bureau then in turn reports to the governing body of the panel. Representatives under Rule 12.5 are entitled to participate provisionally pending a decision by the governing body regarding acceptance of their credentials. Then it says, representatives do not have the right to participate in decision-making until their credentials have been accepted. That means that representatives may sit in their seats, they may participate provisionally, but in terms of actually any decisions being taken, these decisions can only be taken once credentials have been accepted. And so what usually happens is that the report on credentials, based upon as many credentials as the Secretariat has, is submitted to the Bureau and to the plenary as soon as possible after the beginning of the plenary in order to facilitate decision-making. Next slide, please. In terms of the Bureau, in terms of Rule 13, paragraph 1, the Bureau comprises 2 members from each of the 5 regional groups, including 1 chair and 9 vice chairs, one of whom will serve as a rapporteur. Members of the Bureau are nominated under Rule 13, paragraph 2 by their regional groups and elected by the governing body of the panel, bearing in mind the need for the Bureau's membership to have disciplinary, that refers to substantive disciplinary expertise, geographical, regional, and gender balance. Next slide, please. Now, it is also possible that the Bureau invites experts to their meetings who attend as observers. This is provided for in Rule 13, paragraph 3, which says that the Bureau may invite co-chairs of subsidiary bodies, representatives of United Nations, IGOs and NGOs, and experts to attend its meetings as observers. This is also fairly common practice within the United Nations, particularly when co-chairs of subsidiary bodies, or indeed sometimes co-chairs of contact groups, need to come to Bureau meetings to update the Bureau on their activities. In terms of the term of office, this is not yet agreed, but a term of office can be 2 or 3 years with the opportunity for re-election. It is important that we have continuity, that we have some type of institutional memory so that Bureau members are not completely new to what they're doing. Bureau membership starts at the end of the session at which the member is elected, and it ends at the close of the session at which the member's successor is elected. Then, in accordance with UN practice, the chair is rotated amongst the 5 UN regions every year without the possibility of re-election as chair. Next slide, please. The idea under Rule 20 is that Bureau members are elected by the governing body of the panel by consensus, unless there is another form of election to which the governing body has agreed, unless a member requests a Bureau member or members to be elected by a vote, or unless consensus is not achieved. So here I think we still have to work on the procedure for election, but we hope normally the practice in the UN is that Bureau members are elected by consensus. And then Rule 20, paragraph 2 says that if the governing body of the panel decides to elect by vote, the vote will be held at an ordinary session and in accordance with the rules of procedure. So there's a mechanism for electing through a vote. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of subsidiary bodies, unless decided by the governing body of the panel otherwise, the rules of procedure apply mutatis mutandis to the proceedings of subsidiary bodies. Again, that is fairly common UN practice. And each subsidiary body elects its own officers. What that means is that the governing body does not elect officers for subsidiary bodies. Subsidiary bodies are normally responsible for the election of chair, co-chair, bureaus, depending on the governance structure of a subsidiary body. Next slide, please. Now, there is, of course, an interdisciplinary expert committee, which is referred to in the foundational document. Under Rule 22, the membership of the interdisciplinary expert committee relies on the provisions of the foundational document. The term of office for the interdisciplinary expert committee of each member is 3 years with the opportunity for election. The idea is for there to be staggered terms so that no more than half of the committee members are elected at a session of the governing body. And then Rule 22, paragraph 7 says that co-chairs will be elected by members of the committee, and then there has to be a rotation of co-chairs. Next slide, please. Candidates under Rule 23 for the Interdisciplinary Expert Committee are to be proposed by members and observers of the governing body of the panel. And of course, again, in accordance with standard UN practice, one has to take into account disciplinary, geographical region, and gender balance. And each region will nominate 5 candidates for membership of that will nominate 5 candidates for membership of the committee, and when a region can't agree, it is the governing body that decides. Next slide, please. So members of the Intergovernmental Expert Committee will be elected by the governing body of the panel by consensus, unless there's a procedure that is agreed upon for election. And if the governing body decides to elect members by vote, elections will be held during ordinary sessions of the governing body and in accordance with the rules of procedure. Next slide, please. The idea is that the members of the governing body take decisions on substantive matters by consensus, unless otherwise provided for in the rules of procedure. If all efforts to achieve consensus on matters of substance have been exhausted and no consensus has been reached, the decision will be taken as a last resort by 2/3 majority. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of procedural matters, on matters of procedure, there again, members of the governing body have to make every effort to achieve consensus. If all efforts by the panel to achieve consensus on matters relating to procedure have been exhausted and there's no consensus, the decision will be taken by 2/3 majority vote of the members present and voting, unless otherwise provided for. And then Rule 36, paragraph 2 says if the question of whether a matter is procedural or substantive arises, it is the chair who makes that call. However, there can be an appeal to the chair's ruling, which is put to the vote immediately, and the chair's ruling stands unless overruled by a majority of the members present and voting. Next slide, please. Rule 36, paragraph 3 says that when deliverables of the panel are being considered, differing views are to be explained and on request recorded. Differing views on matters of scientific, technical, or socio-economic nature are to be represented in the scientific, technical, or socio-economic document concerned as appropriate in a given context. Differences of views on matters of policy or procedure are to be recorded in the report of the session as appropriate in a given context. Thank you. Next slide. Now, elections are to be held by secret ballot unless the governing body decides otherwise. Next slide. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and we are here to listen to your questions. Over to you, Nalini.
Thank you very much, Stadler and Alvin, for this very rich and informative review of the draft rules of procedure. The next session that we had put in as part of this webinar was to have a Q&A. I think there was a reminder from our colleagues in the Gen to write your questions in the box. And so if we can give you a couple of minutes to perhaps post your questions, having heard now, really in-depth presentations on the rules of procedure from Stadler and Alvin, it would be extremely useful. I think if you have any questions, if you would like any clarification, this would be the time to do so. So I will give you 1 minute, and if not, then we can then go to our concluding part of this session. It might be all very clear, so thank you, panelists, for being very clear in your presentations. It seems that we don't have any questions yet, so perhaps then we could come to our concluding part of the session. I would really like to thank all our panelists for the information they have provided, and also thank you all who have participated in this webinar. We appreciate always your participation. I think, as mentioned by colleagues in the Gen, that the recording of this webinar will continue to serve as a resource on our road to Open-Ended Working Group 3.2. Aha, we have a question. So perhaps I'll just go back a little bit. I will go back to our Q&A if you don't mind. The question we have is about clarifying the status of the rules of procedure presented as rules of procedure, as they are also not agreed until everything is agreed. So maybe over to you, Stadler. I believe these are draft rules of procedure, so perhaps you could
Yes,
just
that
clarify
is
that.
correct, Nalini. They are draft rules of procedure. These draft rules of procedure are bracketed, and there are elements within they are draft rules of procedure, and then within the draft rules of procedure, there are brackets which indicate that member states may have questions or may not agree to specific wording, that wording has to be revisited. In terms of the chronology, the foundational document would have to be adopted first, and then once the foundational document is adopted, then we could turn to other ancillary documents. One of those would be the rules of procedure, and then those rules of procedure would have to be adopted, preferably with clean text. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Stadler. So we've also got a question, I think it's in the Q&A section and not in the chat. So just please bear with us a little bit as we look at both the places in this present for the webinar. So the question, I think it is for Stadler, is will voting be permitted online as the IPCC did during COVID in case the need arises? So do we have provision for undertaking voting in circumstances where in-person meetings are not possible?
For the governing body, it would be very, very unlikely that a voting would be allowed. If, for example, I mean, and this is now going into the future, for example, we do not envisage that 3.2 will be hybrid. I'm correct, right, Nalini? It will be in person only. Nalini? Yeah. So we do not envisage that there will be any form of online voting when it comes to the actual adoption of texts, either at 3.2 or at the intergovernmental meeting. It will be in person only. Whether online voting can be allowed in the future, that would very much depend on the nature of the body. Normally, it would be a subsidiary or technical body, and then modalities would have to be agreed upon by a body in order to proceed with online voting, so that everybody was very clear as to how that happened. And of course, the credentials of those who were participating and voting online would also have to be reviewed very, very carefully. Online voting is a highly, highly exceptional measure. It was used during COVID, but it is not a practice that is generally applied now to United Nations meetings. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you very much, Stadler, for that response. I do not see any more questions. Perhaps I'll give you another 30 seconds, 1 minute. You might be taking in all this information and trying to formulate your questions, so we'll be a bit patient here. Okay, it seems that I think the presentations, of course, were very clear. And thank you so much for the participants who did provide some questions as well. And I hope that the responses provided helped to better understand the process. So I really, again, would like to thank all of the panelists for the information they've provided, and also thank you all who've attended and participated in this webinar, contributed the questions as well. As mentioned also by the Jen, that this recording will be made available and can serve as a resource during your discussions, your deliberations in the lead up to Open-Ended Working Group 3.2. As much of this webinar has been focused on Open-Ended Working Group 3.1, we thought it would be very nice to invite the hosts of Open-Ended Working Group 3.1, the Government of Switzerland, to provide some closing remarks. And it is my pleasure to introduce Ocean Dyer, Waste and Chemicals Focal Point, Federal Office of the Environment of Switzerland, to provide some closing remarks. Over to you, Ocean.
Thank you very much, Nalini. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, first I'd like to thank the Geneva Environmental Network and UNEP for organizing this important webinar series, not only this one, but also the one before and the one that is still to come. Those are very important elements for us to move forward. I am pleased that Switzerland has been able to play a supportive and important role from the start of all efforts to establish a science policy panel on chemical waste and pollution prevention, including hosting the OEWG 3.1 meeting in Geneva. And now, as we stand between OEWG 3.1 and the upcoming of OEWG 3.2, this is a fitting moment to reflect on how far we have come and what still lies ahead. We have received very good information from Linda, Tessa, Stadler, and Alvin on where we stand in the process, and thank you very much for that. I think it was very helpful for us as government, but certainly also for every stakeholder involved in the process. I would like not to come back on what has been presented, but to highlight a few key elements that we believe are of particular importance as we move forward towards OEWG 3.2. First, let me highlight that the establishment of the Science Policy Panel is essential to informing, strengthening, and further advancing international governance on chemicals and waste. This has been strongly reaffirmed by member states during OEWG 3.1. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. We can draw on the strengths of existing models such as IPCC and IPES, while learning from their challenge and improving them. The governing body of the panel will be able to determine and refine the panel's processes and work after its establishment. Not everything has to be decided now. The foundational document is the only document that we absolutely need to prepare for the Intergovernmental Conference, and it should be the focus of our collective efforts. Since certain elements, as we've heard, of the foundational document are interlinked with aspects of the rules of procedure, it might also be sensible to reach agreement on these now. Overall, we made really good progress during OEWG 3.1. I think, Linda, you really presented really well where we made very good progress and where we moved forward. And there are only a few, but important aspects that remain to be resolved. The solutions exist, and they will emerge through continued dialogue and cooperation. In this spirit, I'd like to encourage us all to use the coming months to engage with one another, sharing our expectations, positions, and listening to each other in order to build bridges and find common ground on the few remaining elements to be solved. We are fortunate to have Geneva as a global governance hub for chemicals and waste management, with many MEAs, international organizations, NGOs, and of course the GEN working on the topic. Let's use this platform to strengthen dialogue and cooperation and ensure the successful conclusion of our work. I am convinced of the necessity of establishing this panel, and I trust in the international community's ability to achieve this. As pollution remains the largest environmental risk factor for premature death globally, responsible for 9 million deaths annually, the world is watching us. We must not let it down. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oceane, for those really good concluding remarks. This brings us to the end of this webinar. We look forward to inviting you and see you joining us for our next webinar in the series, which will focus on examples from other panels, and this will be held on the 31st of October. I will now turn back to Diana for any closing notes. So Diana, back to you. Thank you very much for hosting us today.
Thank you very much also to you, Nalini, for guiding us today through this session of this event, and to all those who were able to join us today or are later watching the video of this event. I just wanted here to bring to your attention a few other events coming up. As Nalini just mentioned, the next in this series is taking place on the 31st of October, but we have a few other events addressing pollution coming up. The next is tomorrow. We are discussing issues of concern, also following up on UNEA resolutions, discussing a document that was produced following consultations. It's taking place tomorrow at 1:30 Geneva time. Sorry, looking for my words in English. So looking forward to have also many of you joining us tomorrow. But there are a few more coming up, notably on the road to Busan. We are having a few sessions, so we're looking forward also to have many of you joining us on those occasions. And as it was mentioned at the beginning of this event, you can rewatch this event and find the links to the documents that were presented and a few more resources on the webpage of this session. And the link has been shared many times in the chat. So see you soon in person or online. Thank you very much.